The world of men
Hello?
is ending.
But I just got here. And I will be playing on easy, just so that this Let's Play is not just me swearing all the time. I started this Let's Play of Shadow of Mordor, and then this one, partially for the purpose of giving myself some inspirational material to work on during my NaNoWriMo project for this year, since it has a heavy emphasis on orcs. But it is now November 28th, and I've just gotten into this game because I greatly underestimated how long it would take me to get through the first game. I managed to get at least a little bit of this game in before the end of November. Plus, as I said before, it felt like time to go through this game again. So I'm planning to continue doing this even after November. At this point in time, it is just about 3:30 a.m. on November 30th. I have less than 24 hours to finish off my NaNoWriMo project, which technically is somewhat finished at this point. I'm at 53,000 plus words. So like the technical official NaNoWriMo aspect of the project is done. But the story has a few final pieces of conclusion to happen, which I am planning to get to either later tonight or sometime in the afternoon tomorrow. Tomorrow, I guess, like, technically today. I tend to not think of it as the next day until like 5 a.m. or just whenever I sleep. I'm a late sleeper. What the?
Gondorian folktales abound with drakes, lesser versions of the great dragons who supposedly slumber under the earth. Yet here in Mordor, I've seen them with my own eyes, though from a safe distance, and they are nothing like the storybooks say. They are lethal hunters of the air, rapacious and cruel, apt to torment their prey before eating it. This scale, taken from a drake carcass we found in a ground cave, gives some sense of their size, and how strong they must be to carry such weight aloft.
Drakes are crazy.
Scale of a drake or a full-fledged dragon?
Certainly a drake. Dragons take better care of their scales.
Really? I'm learning stuff. Okay. Yeah, I had figured that drake was a term used for lesser dragons, like smaller, usually less intelligent dragons, in any fantasy world where the writer wanted to have a distinction between the full-fledged, like massive dragons that can talk, and other ones that are like basically just animals that can breathe fire. It is the approach that I took in my own writing, to have drakes be the lesser and also more easily domesticated. versions of dragons, like ones that are more easily bred for war. But I don't know that that's the universal approach. In fact, I thought in the Hobbit movie that Bilbo referred to Smaug as a fire drake, which confused me. But then I was like, well, maybe the full-fledged dragon is like in Calagon.
Have mundane objects as we do.
I don't recall how accurate it is to how in Calagon is actually described in the Silmarillion. But I know that the size scales that I keep seeing on the internet have in Calagon as pretty freaking massive, even in comparison to Smaug. I think I figured out part of what I'm not liking about Talion's new look so much. I don't think any hair is like going over his face. Like it's pretty much always brushed back. And I don't seem to like that as much. It's more tidy. I often like my characters looking more like they've just been in a fight, and they're not worried about getting into another one. And it's hard to get that look with perfect hair. Although constantly perfect hair can be its own version of awesome for fighters, just because that's how good they are, that their hair never gets messed up. But Talion doesn't seem like that kind of character. He doesn't quite seem like the posh type. Celebrimbor, yes. But Celebrimbor is also dead. And like super wrinkly.
This artifact,
Ooh.
a chunk of moonstone, was our last acquisition before
Moonstone.
the Orcs came. A scout found it still smoldering out in the fields where it fell to earth from the moon overhead. I am far from superstitious, but even I wonder whether this bit of fallen moonstone was meant to serve as an ill omen for the disaster that followed.
Moonstone. Now, it's kind of weird for them to think of it that way, because I'm fairly certain that the moon in Middle-earth is a guy in a boat. Not something that they look at as being stone. I can see the people of Middle-earth referring to meteorites as like sky rocks or sky stone or something like that. Moonstone, I don't think they view the moon as that kind of a thing. So that's a bit strange. It's okay. It's okay that I'm here. You're relieved that I'm here. That was the moment that resonated with me the most, somehow. I think because it's so different from what my natural reaction would be in most situations, because when I'm in danger, at least in video games, my panic response is just kill everything. So it's something that I admire about Rey, is her like instinctive approaches. No, there's a less blood-shedding solution to this problem. Instead of making everybody freak out and die in terror, you can just tell them to relax. It's okay. You're relaxed that I'm here. You're relaxed that there is a Karagor here. How am I branding guys through helmets? You think it would be the kind of thing where you have to actually make contact. But yeah, when I think of the branding technique, I picture that being something where like physical contact with the flesh actually seems required. Like, you think it'd be like Loki's staff trying to turn Iron Man, but getting stuck on the arc reactor, preventing contact with the heart. You'd think it'd work something like that. Which is not even how I would think Loki's staff would work. Like, it's magic. It should know how to work its way around the arc reactor. But like, Talion's hand, that's like a physical flesh thing. You'd think it would need to make contact with the other flesh. So apparently, Talion's hand is smarter than Loki's staff, is what it comes down to.
These orcs will suffer now.
Reach the cave. Where do you want to meet up? The cave. Alright, I know exactly where that is. It is this wide open area right here.
Oh, you're right.
I just recently updated my Pinterest board for Orcs vs. Wolves. I forgot to do that as soon as the book was officially published. It took me a couple of weeks to be like, oh yeah, I said I was going to do that. Like, go back in there. The board is already there, but nothing was titled, nothing was categorized. It's just a bunch of images that I've been using for inspiration. But to avoid spoilers, and also potentially people stealing ideas, if anybody's like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. I didn't include names or like descriptions of characters, but once the book was published, it was fine for me to go back into Pinterest and divide the Orcs vs. Wolves board into categories, like the specific names for each character. And one of the things that I forgot to do for inspirational purposes during Nano was go back to my Pinterest board for Orcs vs. Wolves and have a look at some of this material that I collected specifically for inspirational purposes. Because I did have a look on Pinterest to like add pins to the board in, was it September or October? Like shortly before Nano. And by that time I already had a pretty good idea of many of the characters that I wanted to do. Whoa. It was an awkward landing. But as I was looking around on Pinterest the first time, I noticed a few like designs or even just ideas, stuff like small like goblins riding on top of larger orcs. And I'd forgotten about that stuff until like late in November when I went back into Pinterest, because I realized that I needed to add a few characters for like story purposes, and so I needed some new ideas, or to be reminded of some ideas that I'd had before. And then going back on the Pinterest reminded me. Going back into that board that I made for Orcs vs. Wolves reminded me of some of those interesting ideas that I'd had that I forgot about. So it was a good thing that I remembered to do that, to go back in and have a look at that, because otherwise some of those ideas might have been like forever lost, at least as far as this particular project. So yeah, as far as a resource for gathering inspirational material, Pinterest does its job. It's good for that. So this last NaNoWriMo ended up going pretty much the same as the last one. Reaching the 50,000 word count of NaNoWriMo. Ended up reaching that a couple of days before the actual end of NaNoWriMo, which is the same thing that happened with Vampires vs. Dragons. But the actual story wasn't quite finished yet. But I was close to it, like part way through the final battle. So after reaching the 50,000 word count, the only thing left to do was a few more action scenes concluding some of the scenes, and then just adding minor detail. And I got all of the crucial stuff finished, I think the day before the last day of NaNoWriMo. And then the last hours of the last day were just spent doing research. Just making sure that I had certain information right. And because of the content, I ended up Googling a lot of interesting stuff, like different kinds of guns, magazine rounds, loading mechanics, how long the body can survive without certain probably vital organs, how long a heart keeps beating for outside of the body, stuff like that. So I forget what specific thing I was Googling when I got a notification that Google would like to know my location. I was like, I bet they would. One of the things I needed to look up on the last day was varieties of machine guns. Because that's something that I had paid a lot of attention to back in the day, but I haven't really been keeping up with the innovations in machine gun or assault rifle improvement. And I wanted to be able to mention things by name as much as possible. Whenever someone's using a particular kind of weapon and I actually have a particular kind of weapon in mind. And because of what the gun meant to me at the time, because my introduction to it was in the GoldenEye 007 video game, I've always been partial to the P90 type of machine gun. But when I did this research and found out that the way that you reload it is very different from others, I realized it wasn't going to work for what I had in mind. And that's why research is important.
You're right. Staying in Mordor is certain doom. But I cannot leave.
My lady.
Then we will be doomed. Together.
Oh. That seems to be the romance theme in Middle-earth, is being doomed together. And one of the things I focused on, like making sure that I applied in Orcs vs. Wolves, was the feel of listening in on orc conversations. Because I listened to a few in these two games. And they do get pretty funny. Orcs have a very different way of looking at life and the world. And it's interesting and sometimes humorous. And I feel like that's one of the main benefits, entertainment-wise, for getting into these kinds of stories and being immersed in these kinds of worlds, is seeing how these completely different creatures look at things, how they view life, the universe, philosophy, if they have that. It gets very interesting with orcs. I ran into unexpected difficulty starting off NaNoWriMo this past year. And I started with action, which is a fairly common thing for me to do. I think it normally helps. Ooh, I'm glad I made that jump. I think it normally helps to build excitement early on in a story and get the reader hooked quickly. Just start with action. But I was struggling with this one for some reason, and I wonder if it was because I was spending more time explaining stuff than I probably normally would with an opening scene. Not that there was a lot that needed establishing, but it was an introduction to a new kind of a world, being not just a post-apocalyptic environment, but post-apocalyptic with particular forces at play. So I think it required a bit more setup than an opening action scene normally would, because I was dealing with a lot of elements that the audience might not be used to. Particularly since it was also introducing Razor's Head, which was a massive, like, battleship tank with all of these features involved. And you can introduce a bunch of crazy stuff like that in a movie and have it still go at the same pace, but in a novel format where you have to describe everything, it takes a bit longer when you're introducing something for the first time, and maybe that's why it felt a bit slow to me. So that's something I'm gonna try to remember and keep in mind for future projects, that when I'm starting off with an action scene, I need to start with what the reader is already familiar with, as opposed to the things that need introduction that I can describe with just a few words. Now, by the time he got around to publishing The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Tolkien replaced terms like gods for Valar and Maiar, but in the early drafts of his writing he used the term gods. I think that seemed like the easiest thing to do, given the roles that those beings had in his world. But from a Christian perspective, it gets a bit awkward thinking of your characters that way. Regardless of whether or not it's purely fiction, it starts to feel like blasphemy. That's my guess as to why he changed it. But when you look at the material that was published post-mortem by Christopher Tolkien, it goes back to Tolkien's earlier form of writing and use the god terms like Tolkien used to. In Chronomancer, I used the term Valtar, meaning power. Now, if you look at the, like, Greco-Roman version of gods compared to the Judeo-Christian version, the functionality is quite different. Basically, just you've got a thing governing each individual aspect of reality. And that's more or less how I have the Valtar functioning. And I think that's more or less how Tolkien had the Valar functioning as well, as governing individual aspects of reality. But he also had one particular being who was the creator of everything, and the one in charge over all. You are chillaxed that I'm here. Ah, there's that guy riding a boat. Now, that's something I wasn't particularly keen on from Tolkien's mythos regarding the sun and moon. Tolkien's version of, or explanation of the sun, was far more interesting. At least to me and my particular interests when it comes to Middle-earth. That it's basically a good guy female Balrog that is also holding like a leaf from one of the last from one of the two great trees of light. The guy in the boat holds the other one, so I think that's supposed to be where the shine comes from. But they have very different ideas. And very different in terms of coolness. At least in my opinion. When it came to inventing the lore for my own fantasy world, that was one area where I felt I would definitely have to do something very different, was with the explanation of the moon. Because when I look up at the moon at night, and I ask myself, like, what does this make me feel? What is this saying to me? It's not a guy in a boat. But yeah, there is a very specific emotion that I feel when I look at the moon. Particularly when it's not full. I incorporated that into the lore of my world. That is my general approach when it comes to most elements in my stories. And when writing anything in my stories, something I remind myself of is, how do I want people to feel about this? And then I try to be very careful to make sure that I don't have events occurring or have descriptions for things that go against the emotion that I want people to associate with that element. And since the sun and the moon are things that are shared between everyone, they're not just part of my story, it was important to come up with lore around them that fit the way that I think other people feel as well, not just myself. It's not just something that I wanted to come up with for my own story and my story alone, but lore that felt applicable in a more general sense, while still being recognized as myth invented for a story. I can recognize the design of dwarven craftsmanship over Elvish, because there's no curves. It's all like straight lines. I don't know why. That's how they like to do things. I like his helmet design. It goes well with, like, the metal horns go well with his actual horns, while still looking like horns. I've learned from designing characters in Soul Calibur that when you have too many horns on one guy, it's easy for them to stop looking like horns and start looking like tentacles. You have to be very careful with placement and texture of the horns in order for them to actually keep the horn aesthetic that you're going for. And in the case of Targorath, they did it very well. You are relieved that I'm telling you to kill your captain.
Surrender to my command.
You immediately knock him over.
The eagles of the Misty Mountains are more than a myth.
Perhaps. But I doubt they'd fare well against the drakes I've seen.
A full-fledged drake, maybe. Like a fire-breathing one like the one in this game. Because what the Nazgul rode on were something else. Based on Tolkien's description, I saw them as basically seriously messed up birds. That's a paraphrase, but that's the impression I got. But yeah, those flying beasts at the Nazgul ride, they are, I think, Sauron's attempt at imitating the Great Eagles. So a lot of the things created by Sauron and Morgoth were in imitation of other things, probably things that annoyed him the most, like the Ents. As an answer to them, he created trolls, which are completely different things, but large and strong. I guess that's all I cared about. What? Don't worry about it. You're relieved that you're dead. Defeat the lawless and reclaim the final weapons and armor. A bit redundant. This guy calling himself the lawless because he refuses to be part of a tribe, but there is already a tribe called the Outlaws. It's like, no man, those outlaws are too law-centric. I'm even more of an outlaw than the outlaws are. I'm outer outlaw. I'm the outest law there is. No one's an outer law than I am. The only guy in this entire game I don't have any information on. That's how much of an outlaw he is. I refuse to even have a face.
I'm no tribe. I'm not hindered by order. I am chaos.
I am the chaos. I am the outness of the law. I have guys bleeding out all over the place. Very likely a result of them being underleveled. But also, there's nobody here. What the heck are you dying of? Boredom? Come down. You are relieved to tell me all your secrets. You are relieved to be not killing me. Go away. You are relieved that I'm leaving. No, I didn't.
Found the ranger. Looks tired from all that running.
No, I'm not. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the video, and your 20-second warning before the start of the next video. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to leave a like, leave a comment to let me know what you think, and subscribe to stay notified about future content. Until next time, hope you're all staying safe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.